Right. So good morning, or, we're almost in the afternoon. My name is Farah, and I am a clinical social worker working at the LightHouse Arabia. We are the largest outpatient mental health clinic in the Gulf region. We're a team of about 30 psychologists and 3 psychiatrists here, and we're really on a mission to destigmatize mental health in the region. And this is absolutely one of my favorite topics and my favorite talks. And we'll be speaking about how can you recognize the signs that you yourself may be struggling with your mental health, or someone on your teams or in your personal life maybe. Because it always starts with you, right? When you can identify that something may be kind of disrupted within you, you'll also be able to identify it in someone else. We will be talking about what mental health is and how you can recognize the difference between sadness or depression, normal worry versus an anxiety disorder. And we'll look at, if you notice those signs, how can you respond to someone in the most appropriate evidence-based way? Okay, so I'll share my screen with you. I've already mentioned what we'll be doing today, so I'll skip through this. All right. Why is this exceptionally important right now? And when we look at what we've survived through this year, you can imagine and think back to the beginning of this year, where when March hit and the reality of the pandemic sank in for us, where many of us were in lockdown, started working from home, travel plans were disrupted, the economy was disrupted, and there was an overwhelming sense of crisis and panic. And what you can find is that adrenaline really kicked in during really March and April. And many people in workplaces actually started overcompensating. There was a lot of fear of what is going to happen. And as the reality that summer would not be the same started to sink in, many of us experienced massive waves of grief, losing the dream of weddings, baby showers, family gatherings, travel plans, respite, um, uh, losses where people were not able to attend funerals, and really the loss of so many other things like businesses, safety, being able to gather together and feel safe. And you can imagine that many people started focusing on, okay, I just need to get through the summer and I'll get to December or Christmas time and I'll be able to travel and see my family again. And as we're approaching that time, and it's here now, there's another massive wave of grief around, I can't believe this is still here and this is still a part of our reality. Okay? As we even think about what it may feel like on January 1st if we're all still wearing masks, which most likely we will be, and the massive grief response that's there. It's an overwhelming stressor on your mind, your body, and your spirit. And all of this has taken place on top of a pre-existing epidemic of poor mental health. So if we look at the state of mental health before COVID even came along, we know that a quarter of the people around the world are either currently struggling with their mental health or have at some point in their life. We know that mental illnesses do not care if you're American or Emirati or you have 1,000,000 dirhams in your bank account or 500 dirhams. It impacts all of us equally, and resources do not make us immune to developing illness. I'll often have people say to me, but why do I feel this way? I have a great job, I have a great family or income. Those things do not make you immune, right? Now, think of the marathon runner that may develop cancer. While there are things we can do that can really create resilience against illness, nothing makes us 100% immune to either physical illness or mental illnesses. We know that every 40 seconds around the world, someone dies by suicide, and it tends to be more men than women. And suicide rates are also highly correlated with unemployment rates. So we are seeing these numbers rising, which is quite terrifying to imagine. We also know that more veterans die from returning when they've returned from war than actually at war itself, when we look at the impact of high stress environments and trauma. We know that depression is the second most common illness of all illnesses worldwide, and that cardiovascular disease is actually number one. And I think it was in 2015 that the World Health Organization predicted that depression would be the second most prevalent illness in like 2025. We've hit that number way before they could have even predicted. Okay. So, what is mental health? And this is really important. While it may seem simple, most of us, I know, including me, have grown up in homes where we never talked about mental health. We never talked about emotions, actually, because emotions were seen as something that get in the way of good rational thinking. And so let's look at what is mental health, because every single person has mental health the same way every single person has physical health. Okay? Mental health is not the same thing as mental illness, right? And when we look at what good mental health is, it means being able to experience the fullness of all of your emotions. Okay? There's no such thing as negative emotions. Some of them are just uncomfortable to feel. So if you're feeling sad about the uncertainty of traveling or not, or have I made the right decision by going or not going, that it's really understandable to feel a sense of worry or sadness. Okay. Now, we also good mental health is also not about feeling happy all the time. Happiness is a singular state. We don't live in that space. Right? I also want you to know that our mental health lives on a continuum. It's always changing. So some days we can have very good mental health where you're feeling, excuse me, really optimistic, really connected to the people in your life, proud of something that you're working on. And other days and weeks, we can have poor mental health where you're feeling depleted, exhausted, cynical, um, perhaps lonely. Maybe someone has left or you've lost someone and you have poor mental health. We're all shifting on this continuum that's very normal. The same way our physical health is usually fluctuating. Some months we can be more fit than other months in our lives, right? Now, when we look at the onset of recognizing the signs of a mental illness, you're going to see that most days began feeling like difficult days. Okay? And remember, the onset of of mental illness is not sudden, right? It's usually a gradual decline leading to a mental illness. And when I say mental illness, what I mean by that is depression, anxiety, addiction, these are the most prevalent types. So when we see how you can recognize the signs within yourself or someone else, you're never diagnosing, but these are some of those indicators, right? You're going to see major changes to how someone is thinking, feeling, or behaving for most days. It's not a one off. We can all have one offs where we're feeling just off, or we're just like, I don't feel like hanging out with anyone or seeing anyone. We can all have days or weeks like that. It's when most days for an extended period of time, you can see that either low mood, depleted, irritable, where your inner world is now starting to disrupt other parts of your life. It may be your work, it may be relationships, it may be physical health, or it may be your ability to take care of daily things like your home and errands and bills. It may be one of those domains, or it may be all of them, the more severe it becomes. Okay. So, for example, I hope no one's name is Johnson on this webinar, but imagine this hypothetical person, Johnson. If he were struggling and really this is a broad definition of mental illness, you're going to see that he says things like, things that took me 1 to 2 hours are now taking me several days to complete, or I'm struggling to get out of bed. You may see him withdrawing. You may see a very, very loud inner critic that creates a lot of worry or low mood. Okay? We're going to come back to looking more closely at what those signs are of depression or of an anxiety disorder. When you think of the signs you may notice if someone is struggling with their mental health, you may think of some obvious signs, right? Where you may notice that they're tearful, they're crying, they're quite cynical. Like I imagine many of you know Eeyore from Pooh, right? He's quite cynical. Now, these are some obvious signs, but typically this is not the case, right? Signs are usually very difficult to detect, especially with a lot of people, particularly in the region that are very high performing. It's almost like high performing illness. So I think of people like Martin Luther King, who had several suicide attempts as a teenager and struggled with depression throughout his life. Princess Diana struggled with an eating disorder and anxiety. Michael Phelps struggled with debilitating anxiety and suicidal thoughts, and he's the most decorated Olympic athlete in the history of the Olympics. Think of Dwayne Johnson, who's struggled with depression, or Elon Musk, who struggled with anxiety. He's the CEO of Tesla. And I'm sure you can think of many, many other people. I think of people like Michelle Obama or Robin Williams or Kate Spade, or if you're into Bollywood, I think Amitabh Bachchan just talked about his struggle with depression. Now, this is so important because I want to challenge this notion that someone who struggles with their mental health will be able to kind of quickly notice. The very nature of our mental health is very, very invisible, especially you may be looking at someone's social media and thinking, wow, their life looks beautiful. They look beautiful. But that can be so far from the reality of what someone is experiencing, right? No one says, let me take this picture. I'm about to fight with my partner now, right? We don't see that. We see this kind of curated version of people's lives. I want you to know that people can be struggling with anxiety but appear very confident. They can be suicidal but turn up to work and appear fine, or have a panic attack in the bathroom before a client meeting or a client pitch and be performing and doing really well moments later. You can be battling depression but be very funny and tell jokes. You can be deemed the team player in your organization but internally feel a sense of inadequacy or feel worthless to others. You can also be in senior leadership, CEO, senior leaders, but feel a sense of inadequacy or feel like an imposter within yourself. And this is so important because the nature of your mental health and the signs you may notice within yourself or another are very visible. And I'll just stress that you can be very high performing while still struggling internally. It's more about what the inner experience of your life is, which is actually the most experience, is what's happening within you. When we look at how disabling it can be to live with certain mental illnesses, this was a side by side ranking done by the World Health Organization. And what they found was that living with moderate depression is as disabling as living with severe asthma and more disabling than living with epilepsy or low back pain. Living with severe post traumatic stress disorder, which is a type of anxiety disorder, is as disabling as severe chronic emphysema, which is a disease of the lungs. So it makes it, imagine if I walked from here to that, my office door there, I would feel like I've run a marathon. Okay, so um, quite debilitating. I want you to know that severe depression is as disabling as disseminated breast cancer. And by disseminated, we mean that the cancer has spread to other parts of your body. Okay? Severe depression is more disabling than living with severe chronic emphysema, severe vision loss, severe asthma, epilepsy, and low back pain. Okay? And severe schizophrenia and severe dementia, which are both mental and physical illnesses, are equally as disabling. Okay, so I want that to kind of absorb for a minute or to process that. Because imagine when someone comes into your home and says, oh, I have some back pain. We're like, can we get you a pillow? Can we, are you okay? Are you comfortable? But imagine when someone comes to you with severe depression and says, I'm struggling to get out of bed today. People say things like, oh, be positive, you should be thankful you're in the UAE, or, it's all in your head. That is actually a very harmful response to have. And as a therapist that specializes in grief, trauma, and health anxiety. And now I'm realizing I didn't introduce myself fully, but I do specialize in working with grief and trauma, depression, and I'm also the director of the mental health first aid program here at the Lighthouse. But when you're working with health illnesses, humans have this really huge capacity to be resilient. So you'll often hear people say things with cancer like, now I'm working less, or now I'm more present in my relationships, or when I feel better, I will travel here, or I'll try this. There's still the capacity to experience pleasure while experiencing physical illnesses. Depression is one of the only illnesses that actually really diminishes your ability to experience pleasure, right? So there is no, it's almost like someone described it once as the inability to enjoy sunsets or sunrises. But imagine all of the things that you love doing: walking, music, food, socializing, certain work projects, spending time with your children. Imagine the ability to experience that pleasure being completely diminished. It's actually quite terrifying. Okay? I think depression is one of the most terrifying diseases. Okay. We know that your mental health is very connected to your physical health, right? That your mind and body, they share a neurochemical language. And when we look at if mental illnesses like depression or anxiety disorders go untreated, it can literally take years off your life. It can worsen symptoms of chronic pain, of digestive issues, of diabetes and insulin. These studies have been done in people who are survivors of stroke or cancer, that if there is untreated underlying mental illness, it significantly shortens our lives and the quality of our physical health. So they're very, very interconnected, and that's really important. Okay. The dream with mental health care is early intervention. So if we can know the signs within ourselves or someone else and catch it sooner than later, then the health outcome is going to be significantly better as well. Right? So imagine if you can catch the onset of cancer or diabetes sooner, right? It's not going to impact your organs or your livelihood in the same way. And the same is true with mental health care. But we know that majority of people will never seek professional help. It's actually 2 in 3 people never seek professional help. We also know that majority of people will have their first episode of a mental illness by the age of 14. So that means like a depressive episode or a struggle with an anxiety disorder at the age of 14, which is quite a kind of a fundamental developmental. It's quite a developmental milestone age where a lot is changing socially and physically. Imagine living with an illness, and what we find is that it typically goes undiagnosed for 10 years before that person ever seeks professional help. Now, imagine for 10 years thinking, gosh, if I was just stronger, faster, better, prettier, right? What that is going to do to your self-esteem, to your career choices, to your relationships. Right? It's actually quite terrifying to think of. Right? All right. We're now going to take a closer look at how to recognize the signs of depression and anxiety, because these are the most common types of illnesses. And remember, I want you to be thinking about between you and you, even before you think about between someone else. And you're not diagnosing. Anytime we're diagnosing these things, then you need to check in with a mental health professional or a GP. Okay, so what is clinical depression? Does anyone in today's webinar like Harry Potter? You can just raise your hand. Anyone like Harry Potter? All right. So there are these creatures in Harry Potter, and they're called dementors, and there are these dark shadowy creatures, and they're what I imagine a jinn looks like, which is like a Muslim demon creature. And these creatures, when they come near Harry Potter, it's like white light is leaving his mouth. And he says, it's like all joy has left my body, all happy memories feel miles away. And this is actually, the author describes these dementors as depression because it's not just a sad time. At most, it's being completely numb or devoid of emotion altogether. So I'll have teens say to me they were dreaming of going to Ivy League schools. And if they're depressed, they'll say, I don't even care if I graduate this semester or if I finish. I'll have parents say to me, I used to love spending time with my children, and now it means nothing to me. And really, one of those hallmark signs of depression is no longer being able to enjoy things that you used to. And I will really emphasize this is a biological, psychological illness. And it can also be environmental. Usually it is all three. If we look at the very architecture of sleep in a depressed individual, it is completely disorganized, again, indicating this is a biological illness. We know serotonin levels in the mind will be decreased, which is that kind of that feel good neurochemical. Okay. We also know that if you look at, sometimes when people say depressed, they think Eeyore, right? Like, so that kind of like, oh, they're lazy or they're slow moving. But if we actually look at what's happening within the physical body, we'll find that the stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, can be very, very high within a depressed individual. So it's almost like there's a war happening, which creates a lot of exhaustion and depletion. Okay, so some of those signs that you may notice in yourself or someone else, so no longer enjoying things, a low or flat mood that lasts at least 2 weeks, but we know that it can go on for months and months. And the longer it goes untreated, the worse it can become. Okay. There may be tearfulness. And remember, I'll have people say to me, but I was laughing earlier, or, yesterday seemed like a good day. Does that mean that I'm not depressed? And the answer is no. You can be high functioning, right? Or you can have moments where you feel, that was a good moment, but it's most days in your inner world feel like difficult days. Okay. So there may be a lot of exhaustion, tiredness, hard to make decisions or concentrate. You may, as we've said, see disrupted sleep, overeating or undereating. You may see irritability or anger, which is very, very common in men and teens. So this is like outbursts of anger, because we know that men are not socialized to feel their feelings. And so anger is usually the most socially acceptable emotion to express. And I promise you, it's not that men do not feel, they feel everything and more, but they haven't been, for many men, they haven't been given permission to feel their feelings, okay? And for women too. Now, depression can range from mild, moderate, and severe. So, with more mild to moderate depression, you can hear an indifference towards life. So, it's like, I don't really care what happens to me. You know, if something happened to me, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Whereas with more severe depression, you can actually observe thoughts or a plan to end one's life or of suicide. Okay. So, just to summarize, we all experience sadness. This is a very healthy human emotion to experience. Now, if I'm feeling sad about not traveling in December to see my family, I'm maybe my behavior changes in a minor way. So I'm a bit more quiet or withdrawn. Maybe I don't feel like socializing that evening, but there are still things I will enjoy. I will still enjoy. I promise I don't have COVID. I just have a bit of a dry throat, but I may still, enjoy taking a walk or speaking to my husband or watching Oprah videos. With depression, you are no longer enjoying things that once brought pleasure. And you're seeing significant changes in thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And depression can be described as being in an abusive relationship with yourself. So you will be hearing a very loud inner critic. It's almost like this inner monologue where you have a part of you that is criticizing, scrutinizing, judging you. almost feel there can be a lot of inadequacy. Okay. All right, that's that in a nutshell of what we've been speaking about. We're now going to shift gears and look at what is anxiety. And after we speak about this, we'll look at what are some core things you can do to take care of you, and then we'll focus on how can I respond to someone in my life who may be struggling. Okay? So when we think of clinical anxiety, let's first talk about what is anxiety, because we all experience anxiety, and it's a very healthy, helpful human emotion. So some anxiety, if you had zero anxiety and you went to, I don't know, Spinneys, you may be hugging people and shaking their hand and not wearing a mask. Okay? So some anxiety actually lets you know, uh, I care about this. This is important to me. I'm going to make sure I keep myself safe or focus on this. Some anxiety before a big presentation or, a deadline, that's understandable. Your mind and your body are saying, this is something we care about, this is important. Now, there's another helpful anxiety or stress response in our body, and that is called the fight or flight response. So, for example, if you are in the grocery store and it looks like Johnson, hypothetical Johnson, is approaching you or some stranger, and it looks like they're about to sneeze at you. Okay? This is going to activate your fight or flight response. And every system and organ in your body that is not needed to fight this person or to run away is going to shut down. You do not need digestion, fertility, or even your frontal lobe, like this area, which is where higher order thinking happens. You don't need it to fight or to run away. So, what does turn on is your heart starts racing, blood is racing to all of those major muscle organs in your body to run or to fight this person. Now, that's actually really helpful when there's a threat in your life, right? Your body's like, we have to respond to this. Now, humans are the only creatures that can think their way into a panic. So, having the thought, I may die, no one likes me, right? These thoughts can actually trigger the fight or flight response. Okay? And really, a hallmark sign of an anxiety disorder is that the level of fear or worry does not match the situation. So imagine logging into this webinar where you're completely anonymous, but feeling the level of worry as if you were going to present to 1,000 people, in person, or the worry as if someone was going to sneeze on you when you're just going to meet a friend for coffee. Okay? That is really a hallmark sign of an anxiety disorder. Okay? It is a very physical reaction, as you can imagine, because the body is being thrown into the fight or flight response. Now, imagine if you're struggling with anxiety and you're in a Zoom meeting, but your body is saying, we need to fight or we need to run away. Of course, it's going to be very, very difficult to concentrate or even to retain information. Okay. So, what are some of the physical symptoms of anxiety disorders? Some of them you've already heard, right? So, that pounding heart, chest pain, blushing, dizziness, numbness, GI issues. And that's a really common one. People will go through to see several doctors saying, you know, my stomach is getting really upset, almost like IBS symptoms. They said I'm just stressed. No, that's not stress. That's actually can be a sign of an anxiety disorder. Okay? Restlessness, thoughts are racing, and most people don't say, I'm anxious. You may hear them say, and this is one of those signs where you hear people say, I can't switch off. My mind is racing. Okay. Or I'm struggling to concentrate. And remember, it's not just a one-off. We can all have a one-off where we're feeling anxious. It's most days begin feeling like difficult days, and it's starting to interrupt your life in some way. Okay. You may see anger, feeling confused. If there's a specific type of phobia, and phobias are a type of anxiety disorder, there can be social anxiety or a fear of flying. If that is a situation, you may notice a person avoiding the trigger. Okay. And really commonly is the longer anxiety goes untreated or anxiety disorders, the more likely anxiety's best friend comes along, which is depression. And the longer depression goes untreated, depression's best friend comes along, which is anxiety disorders. And the longer those two go untreated, their other best friend comes along, which is addiction. Okay. Another reason why early intervention is so important. Okay. So, just as a summary, normal worry, we all have worry, right? We all experience anxiety. That's actually a very healthy and normal response. Clinical anxiety is much more significant. It can be triggered by a specific event, but not necessarily. Some people can just wake up most days with a sense of dread or worry or feeling like there's an elephant on your chest or kind of like a knot in your stomach. Okay. Now, you never ever see suicidal thoughts or behaviors with normal worry, okay, or even normal sadness. That is a red flag that someone may need additional, or actually not may, does need additional support or help. Okay. Also, very similar to depression, with clinical anxiety, you will see a very loud inner narrator that can be almost like always judging, scrutinizing. Did I do that right? Did I not? What are other people thinking? It's a lot of internal fear and judgment. And imagine if you had a manager that all day sat next to you and said, "Why did you do that? You should have done that differently." Or, "What do people think of you?" Or, "What's wrong with you? Why did you do that?" Imagine having a manager that did that to you all day or all week, most of the time. Of course, that's going to impact your mood. The same is true when we speak to ourselves that way, which is really a symptom. Okay. So, what are some of those additional signs, those broad signs that someone may be struggling? It may be depression, it may be anxiety, or they may be at risk of those things. You may notice that there are changes in their appearance, okay, their hygiene or their weight. And remember, it is not a one-off. We can all have a moment where you turn the Zoom camera on, you're like, whoa, you know, that person doesn't look like themselves today. Maybe they've been working on something late, or they're exhausted, or they have a child that's sick. It's not a one-off. It's most days you're saying, wow, Johnson hasn't looked like himself in a while. Okay. You may notice that their environment is chaotic a lot, indicating they're struggling to take care of their home or their space. You may notice that they're not responding at all or taking a very, very long time. And remember, again, it's not a one-off. It's most of the time. For other people, you may notice that they're over responsive. Okay. That can often indicate a lot of anxiety as well. They may respond or send emails or messages very late at night, 1 a.m., 3 a.m., indicating that they're struggling to sleep. You may notice that they're wearing pajamas late into the day. And it's not just pajama bottoms. I know everyone this year at some point has wore pajamas bottoms in a Zoom call, but maybe their shirt as well, right? Indicating that they're struggling to take care of themselves. You may notice more and more errors in their work, or that they're withdrawing from e-platforms, like saying goodbye on social media, or just withdrawing, okay? You may notice that things that took them a shorter amount of time are taking them a lot longer, which feels unlike them. They may be quite cynical most of the time, right? Where, quite doom and gloom. You may notice that they're just missing meetings, important meetings, not showing up. And I've also found in workplaces that sometimes you may notice someone is just never turning on their video or their audio, which may indicate that they are struggling. Okay. And it's not a one-off. And they may be explicitly saying, "I don't feel well, I'm not doing well," or posting about that on their social media. Okay. These are all signs that someone may be struggling. It may be one of them, or it may be several of them. So, what are the things that you can do to take care of your mental health? And then we're getting to how to respond. And I'm only briefly speaking about this. I'm going to tell you essentials so that we can focus more on how to respond to others. So, your foundation. And when I say foundation, imagine the Burj Khalifa, right? Like the foundation has to be really, really good in order to build a beautiful structure on top. And your foundation of your mental health, of good mental health, is sleep. We actually do talks entirely on sleep. So you must make sure you're getting 7 hours of uninterrupted sleep. Otherwise, you are sleep deprived and it is going to completely destabilize your physical and mental health, really. So make sure you're sleeping. So if you have been feeling low or worried, start there. Get really protective about sleep hygiene, limiting blue light, pajamas, candles, essential oils. Really having a routine around bedtime is going to be really important. Making sure you're exercising, physical movement. And I know that you all know that you should exercise, right? But it is also really important for your mental health, which is also true for water and good nutrition. Okay, so that's your foundation. That's always where you want to start. If you don't have that foundation, none of the other stuff I say really matters. I also want you to start paying attention to really your inner world. This is this is actually the most important experience of your life, is what's happening within you, not outside, not what you take a picture of and post on social media. It's your inner experience of your life and of your world. And I want you to start paying attention to emotions, and particularly emotional pain. So imagine if you came to me and said, gosh, Farah, my stomach hurts most evenings. We'd start paying attention. We'd say, what are you eating? What time in the evening are you eating? Tell me more about that. The same is true if you notice you're feeling things like resentment, anger, guilt, sadness, envy. We would start looking at that. So I would ask things like, how long have you been feeling that way? What does that emotion look like? And just start getting curious. You can do that with a trusted friend. You can do it by journaling. And of course, you can always do that with a counselor as well. Okay. I also want you to pay attention to emotional triggers. For example, what a trigger is let's say if my eye is hurting, which actually it has been. I don't know what happened, but let's say my eye is hurting and Johnson comes along and he kind of like pokes me in my eye, which would hurt anyways. He will trigger physical pain, right? And the same is true when we are carrying um, where we can stockpile emotional pain, right? So let's say something happened to us a few months ago, and that person really hurt you or they upset you, and you're like, you just ignored it. You stockpiled it because pain just doesn't go away, right? Like the body keeps score. And if you tend to stockpile pain, you may be triggered more than others. And someone says something to you or something happens and you have a big reaction. It may be anger, it may be sadness or tears, or it may be completely shutting down. And we've all had this happen. It will usually your partner, your husband, or your wife will be the person that can really trigger you, right? Where we're like, wow, what do you mean when you said that? So be really curious about, what was that? How long have I been feeling that way? And start gathering almost information like you're investigating, right? You may also investigate, of course, with the counselor. We are experts at being able to process emotions, look at things in an unbiased way. This is really, really important. And I really want to change this notion that you only see a counselor if you're in crisis. Of course, if there's a trauma or a loss, of course, we're here for that as well. But it's always important to check in sooner than later. I'll have so many people say to me, I just didn't think it was a worthy issue to come in for, right? Which is extremely dismissive. It's always better to come in sooner than later. Now, the research tells us when people start paying attention to their emotions, they usually only know 3 emotions, which is happy, sad, and angry. Those are not the only 3 emotions. There are actually dozens and dozens and dozens of them. So really a tenet of good or great mental health is beginning to build emotional granularity. Because remember, things like anger is a secondary emotion. It never comes first, right? So anger is actually a reaction to other emotions. Underpinning that may be, I felt disrespected, I felt inadequate, I felt afraid. So get really good at being curious about your emotions. Okay. This will help you process what you're feeling, and it can also help you communicate to a manager, to a partner, to a friend what came up for you, what your experience was. Okay, I'm just going to go back for a second. And there are actually charts with a lot more emotions than this. The other thing I'll say is I want you to get really curious, and this is really a starting point, a foundational starting point, is get really curious about what type of relationship you're in with yourself. It is the most important relationship you will ever be in. So start observing your thoughts. Okay. And that is, imagine, the weather is always changing, but the sky is always there. And if I say to you, you are the sky, right? There's a part of you that is observing or experiencing thoughts and feelings. Your thoughts and feelings are the weather, they're always changing, they're coming and going and shifting. So start getting really curious about observing your internal forecast. What do my thoughts look like? How do I speak to myself when I make a mistake? How do I speak to myself when I do something really well? Do I celebrate it, acknowledge it? Do I allow myself to sit with it? Or do I judge myself, criticize, scrutinize, demean? Or am I neglectful? Or I just never even check in? How are you doing? How are you feeling? What was your day like? Now, if you are in an unhealthy relationship with yourself, as many of us are, especially if you've experienced parents that have not modeled healthy relationships with themselves, then we can internalize the inner critic that our parent was. Whether that was a harsh relationship or a neglectful one, that can make the critic even worse. But start observing that and being curious about, would I say or respond to a loved one the way I'm responding to myself? That's your kind of litmus test. And if the answer is no, you must start noticing and also to start thinking about, okay, how can I replace that thought or move towards having a more respectful or compassionate thought? And there's actually, this isn't just a Farah thing, right? There's a lot of neuroscience behind that. When someone responds to us with compassion, or even with kindness or respect, it activates a system in our body called the tend and befriend system in our mind. And you can actually see heart rate calming, frontal lobe kind of coming back online if you're overwhelmed. It's actually very soothing. And the same is true if you respond to yourself with compassion. So it's super important. Okay. Jump forward. So if you've noticed that you think someone else in your life, personally or professionally, is struggling, let's look at how you can respond. Okay. And the first thing you'll want to do is check in, then connect with them and clarify that they have the right information. So let's look a little bit more closer at these three C's. So the first thing you want to do is you cannot support someone else if you're not okay first. Right? Imagine if you're standing with like an empty cup of water and Johnson comes along and he's like, can I have some water? You're going to be like, no, how dare you even ask me? And so if you try to pour from an empty cup, you will also plant the seeds of resentment in that relationship. Okay. So first check in with yourself, make sure you're okay. You have good mental and physical health that day. And then you want to reflect on your data points. What things have you noticed that have you concerned about that person? Maybe you've noticed they've been more withdrawn for the last few weeks, or that a lot of those signs that you've learned about anxiety or depression. Reflect on that and then make sure you have time. It cannot be that you have 5 minutes and now you're checking in on someone. Make sure you have 15, 30 minutes to sit with that person. And ideally, you can do it in person, but you can also do it in Zoom. Make sure you're in a confidential space, right? Because when you're asking about how someone's feeling and doing, of course, you want to have privacy. So check in with the person. Hey, Johnson, what's a good time for us to check in and see how you're doing? You may even say to them, I am alone. I'm in a confidential space. I wanted to see how things have been for you. And when you're checking in regards to someone's mental health, You ideally do not want to have performance related or work specific conversations. Okay. Now, we really expand on this in our mental health first aid training, where individuals are trained in how to extensively identify and respond to someone who may be struggling or experiencing a mental health crisis. So you're checking in with them, and then you want to make sure you are using empathy. And remember, empathy is a very measurable skill. The more you practice it, the better you will become at it. And empathy is being curious about the emotion and trying to understand how the person feels. And usually when, imagine your friend or your partner comes in and says, "Gosh, I had such a stressful day." And you're like, "Okay, oh, that's too bad." That's actually sympathy. That's not empathy. Empathy is being curious. So I may say, "Well, tell me more about that. What part of your day was stressful? What was so stressful about it?" So we're using open ended questions and we're being curious with empathy. Like, what did that feel like for that person? Okay. And remember, no one likes sympathy. Sympathy is like, "Oh, that's too bad. I feel bad for you." Sympathy actually creates disconnect in relationships. And this is actually just a good, you know, it's a great skill to have professionally, but also just personally in your friendships, in your relationships, is practicing empathy is what creates connection and deep meaning in relationships. Okay. So try to understand what they're experiencing. So some of the things that you do not want to say as someone is telling you how they're doing, it could be worse. You just have to be positive, which is toxic positivity, right? If someone says, "I feel angry or sad," and you're trying to fix it, that's not helpful. Because remember, all emotions are neutral. Some of them are just difficult to feel. You don't want to say things like, "Stop being so negative," or "Be strong," or "Never give up." And while that may sound like a good things to say, again, you're trying to fix or solve the emotion, which is not empathy. Empathy is being curious and being with. You also don't want to say things like, "Oh, you shouldn't feel that way," or "I'll be okay," or "You have to be strong for your partner or your kids." Again, that's not listening. That's not empathy. That's trying to fix. Okay? And remember, empathy never begins with "at least." So someone says, "Gosh, I'm feeling really low," like, and I actually hear this a lot as a grief counselor. Someone says, I've lost someone, I'm devastated. And the response is, "Well, at least you had some time together, or at least they lived that long," or, someone says they're struggling in their marriage, and "Oh, at least you're married." That's not helpful. That's actually very dismissive. Please be compassionate to yourself as you're looking at these, because most people actually say these things, but it is not empathy. You may want to say something like this, okay, which is, "I'm sure it feels hard to be positive in a situation like this if something specific has happened. I can't imagine what this has been like for you or what it is like for you. I'm here to listen if you'd like to talk. This is really tough. I'm here with you. Is there anything I can do today or this week to help you? What has this week or month been like for you?" Okay. And you want to encourage self care as well. What have you been doing to take care of yourself? Okay. Other things that you can ask, those open ended questions, would be, "Tell me more about what this has been like for you. How have you been feeling?" Most people respond by saying, "Well, I'm stressed," but isn't everyone's had a tough year. So you may say, "You're right, everyone has, but tell me more about what this has been like for you. I've noticed lately that you don't seem like yourself," and you're being curious. And remember, if someone does not respond, or they don't want to speak to you, or you can see that they're shutting down, of course you must respect that. You will never guilt someone or shame someone and say, "You really seem messed up." Don't do that. But responding with empathy is that best practice approach. Okay. And then as you're speaking to them, if you're noticing and hearing more and more that they're exhibiting signs of depression or anxiety, or just hearing that they've really been struggling, you want to make sure they have the right information to get help. Okay. You're not convincing them like you should really see a counselor. No, but you may ask, like, Are you open to calling our EAP program? Are you open to telling your doctor how you've been feeling? You may even ask if they've shared with anyone in their life, a friend or a family member, and making sure they know where to get help if they want to. Okay, so you may say, "Are you open to seeing a counselor?" And remember, there's a lot of stigma, right? So they may say like, "What? What's a counselor? What are they going to do?" So educating yourself on what a counselor does can be really, really helpful. Okay. This is more informational for you. It is very rare that you should ever say to someone, I think you should see a psychiatrist. But I want you to know the difference, because psychiatrists prescribe medication and they're really experts at managing risk or also really helping with disrupted sleep. And psychologists are, we're doing talk therapy. We do not prescribe medication. And GPs can also be a really good first port of call because they can help eliminate or rule out any underlying medical reason for why someone is feeling super stressed or super low. So that's also a great resource. So you may ask, are you open to telling your doctor? Are you open to seeing a counselor? Okay. And you're not convincing, you're just making sure they have the right information. Now, other resources can be referring the person to a mental health first aider. You may already have some in your organization. And mental health first aid is an evidence based international training, and it's the equivalent to physical first aid, but for mental health. So they're really informal first responders. They know how to identify the signs that someone's becoming unwell more in depth, much more in depth than you've learned today, and how to respond. They also learn how to respond to mental health crises. So, what do we do if someone is suicidal or having a panic attack, or the after effects of substance abuse, after effects of trauma, or the severe effects of substance abuse? So those are mental health first aiders. We do provide those trainings just for workplaces, and we have trainings each month for organizations. You can email me about that if you have more questions. Okay. You can also refer them to HR in your organization, who usually will be able to answer questions like, is therapy covered in our insurance plan? Do I need a referral from psychiatry? HR will often have resources that can further help this person. Now, religious or faith leaders may be meaningful for some people, but not for others. So again, this is more informational. You may just ask them, like, who have you shared this with? And you may have an employee assistance program in your workplace. If you don't know, find out. There's usually a certain amount of like legal counseling, financial counseling, and sometimes psychological counseling that's available. I find that most people, a lot of organizations have these, but they're really underutilized. So find out about that. Okay. And before we take some question and answers, I'll say that when you think about responding to mental health in your workplace, the first thing I'll say is, even if you are not going to be empathic and supportive to the cause of mental health, then you must do no harm. I think that's really important. That means don't spread misinformation and stigma about mental health, mental illnesses, to make sure you're not being judgmental and spreading toxicity around topics of mental health. If someone does disclose that they're struggling with their mental health, make sure that you're protecting their confidentiality to the best of your ability. So not go around and saying, Johnson, he's really, not doing so well. He's depressed. You want to protect excuse me. You want to protect confidentiality. You also don't want to turn a blind eye, which can do more harm. Be curious about your gaps in knowledge and where you may want to attend further trainings or inform yourself on how to be supportive. Okay. Now, a step up would really be enabling others, incorporating mental health in the workplace. So that means not just spending the first 30 seconds of a meeting, like, how is everyone, and then moving on. That means actually creating intentional spaces to check in and see how people are doing, whether it's one-on-one or in a group setting, and have conversations. So you may say, today I spent an hour of my day learning about mental health and talking about it and almost role modeling that it's okay to speak about this the same way we would speak about our physical health. Okay. Now, we often also find that leaders and managers, when you speak about your journey, if you feel comfortable to do so, that can really empower others to also get help if they're struggling. And when you think about managing performance in your workplace, you must also think about managing well-being, because if you expect, if you have high expectations, there must also be high support, and that must include mental health as well, because there really cannot be true health without mental health as well. Okay. You may also go on to take a mental health first aid course. And the best thing you can do is to take care of your own mental health, right? Especially if you are a parent or a leader, because remember, leaders can, unconsciously in organizations represent parental figures. So imagine if mom and dad said, you guys should all have good mental health, but they don't take care of themselves. Children will do what you do, not what you say. So make sure you're taking care of yourself, right? So we're going to, I think we have a few minutes left. Okay, I have time for one question. So let's see. So we have a question. It says, how can I fight the feeling of being disinterested in things I want to accomplish? How can I fight this feeling of hating myself? I think that the first step is being really aware of that, and start noticing, how do how do I hate myself? How do I speak to myself? How long have I been in this destructive or painful relationship with myself? And remember, thought control does not work. So it's not like I'll say, just stop feeling that way and it will change. Usually there are reasons why we've developed painful relationships with ourselves. If someone has taught us to feel that way about ourselves, or we've had difficult experiences in childhood that can really fuel an unhealthy relationship with ourselves. So start observing it a lot. And this is the tool of mindfulness. How am I speaking to myself? So thought control doesn't work. So imagine if all day you said, be kind to yourself, or I shouldn't feel this way, I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't say to myself, oh, you're a horrible person. It's the equivalent of saying, don't see the red balloon, don't see the red balloon, don't see the red balloon. You'll actually see it everywhere. So it's important that when the red balloon arrives or the hateful feelings arrive, you notice them. You're like, oh, here's the red balloon. I don't like this. What does it feel like when the red balloon arrives or that hatred arrives? And making sure that you are noticing that as a thought pattern. So your feelings are not facts. And we're typically in our darkest place when we believe that what we're thinking is a fact. So, for example, when you have moments when you think, well, I really screwed up there. How could I do something like that? What's wrong with me? When that feels like a fact, we're in a dark place. As opposed to the tool of mindfulness, which says, wow, I'm feeling a sense of failure. I'm feeling critical of myself. How can I speak to myself about what happened in a more respectful way? How would I speak to my sister if she said she was feeling like a failure? I may, my tone will change. I may say, you know, Sophia, that's my sister's name, Sophia. You know, that sounds really hard. I think you're being really hard on yourself. So the entire tone will change, and this is a process. So I encourage you to even go and if you Google self-compassion, Kristen Neff, she's really the founder of what we call compassion focused therapy. And she has like great self assessments, videos on how you can begin integrating more of a respectful or compassionate relationship with yourself. But of course, if you're noticing that, you know, dismantling our inner critic can be really hard. You know, like I think I'm still working on that. The only difference is, as a therapist, it's like when my inner critic comes up now, I'm like, oh, there you are. I'm being hard on myself. And I have a really big toolkit to respond. Okay. So thank you for taking the time to attend today's webinar. We will be sending you a recording and a handout. And yeah, I hope you take care of yourselves. Thank you.